On the night of my wedding, the chief housekeeper abruptly sealed the door, pulled me aside, and urged, "Put on different clothes and leave through the back, now." I followed her instructions, and it ended up saving my life. The next day, I dropped to my knees before the woman who had rescued me. My name is Alara Voss, and I was 26 years old on the night I was supposed to become the happiest woman in the province of Carenthal. I had spent 11 months planning the wedding. The flowers, the music, the 3-tiered cake frosted in cream and studded with candied violets, the guest list that filled 4 pages and included dignitaries whose names carried enough weight to make my future mother-in-law smile with the satisfaction of someone collecting trophies. I had chosen the dress myself, a construction of ivory silk and hand-sewn lace that had taken the Madame Fortier's atelier 6 weeks to complete, and I had selected the venue, the Aldermore Estate, a sprawling property on the eastern edge of the city that smelled of old wood and older money. I had tasted every dish on the reception menu, argued with the florist about the precise shade of blush in my centerpieces, and done everything that was expected of a woman marrying a man like Dorian Holt. And on the evening of the 15th of September, with candles glowing in every window and the string quartet already warming up in the East Ballroom, I stood in the bridal suite on the 2nd floor of Aldermore Estate and believed, with the uncomplicated conviction of someone who has not yet learned to doubt herself, that everything was going to be exactly as beautiful as I had imagined it. The bridal suite was a room I had visited twice before the wedding day, and both times it had struck me as grand in the way that rooms built to impress, rather than comfort, tend to be grand, cavernous, furnished with pieces too beautiful to use comfortably, lit by a chandelier so elaborate it seemed to belong in a different century. But on the evening of the wedding, it was transformed by the presence of my bridal party, 6 women in rose-colored gowns, my mother in pale blue, the hairstylist and her assistant, the makeup artist, the photographer who moved around the edges of the room snapping candid moments. There was champagne, there was laughter. My best friend Cora helped me into the dress, and when I finally stood before the full-length mirror and saw myself, the silk, the lace, the dark hair pinned with pearl clips, the lipstick the exact shade of a red rose, I felt something shift inside me, some tightening of emotion I could not have named in that moment, but that I recognized afterward, in the long retrospect of everything that followed, as the last moment of a certain kind of innocence. The ceremony was scheduled for 7 o'clock. At 6:45, the bridal party was ushered downstairs by Sylvie, the wedding coordinator, who had the focused efficiency of someone managing a military operation rather than a celebration. My mother kissed my cheek. Cora squeezed my hand at the door. The photographer captured the last images of me alone in the room. And then they were gone, and I was standing in the bridal suite by myself for the first time all day, and the sudden quiet was enormous. I had requested those final minutes alone, that brides often found a moment of stillness before the ceremony to be grounding, centering, a chance to breathe before the day became something public and permanent. I stood at the window and looked out at the estate gardens, where the last pale light of the September evening was settling over the hedgerows, and I tried to locate the feeling I thought I was supposed to have, the feeling of certainty, the feeling of rightness, the feeling of a woman crossing a threshold she has chosen freely and without reservation. I was still searching for it when the door opened. I assumed it was Sylvie, coming to tell me it was time. I turned, arranging my face into the expression of a bride ready to walk down the aisle, and instead found myself looking at a woman I had spoken to only twice before, once at the estate tour and once at the walkthrough, a woman whose name I knew only because it appeared on the list of Aldermore staff that the venue coordinator had provided at the beginning of our booking process. Her name was Agnes Hartwell. She was the chief housekeeper of Aldermore Estate. She was perhaps 60 years old, a compact, straight-backed woman with silver hair cut close to her head, and dark eyes that held a quality of alert stillness I would later come to recognize as the expression of someone who has seen a great many things and learned to process them quietly. She was dressed in her uniform, a dark dress, sensible shoes, and she moved with the particular economy of motion that comes from decades of navigating large houses efficiently. She stepped into the room and, without a word of greeting or explanation, reached back and turned the key in the lock of the door she had just come through. The sound of the tumblers engaging was small but precise in the quiet room. I stared at her. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said, because I could not think of anything else to say. She crossed the room toward me with a directness that was somehow not aggressive, but brooked no delay, and she took my hands in both of hers, her grip firm, her palms dry, and she looked at me with those dark, still eyes, and said in a voice pitched low and steady, "Miss Voss, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to trust me, and I need you to do exactly what I tell you without asking questions until we are somewhere safe. Can you do that?" I remember the specific quality of my confusion in that moment, not the sharp reactive confusion of someone who has been startled, but a deeper, more disorienting kind. The confusion of someone whose mental model of a situation has been quietly invalidated and who has not yet constructed a replacement. I was standing in my wedding dress, with my hair pinned with pearl clips, 6 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, and the chief housekeeper of the venue was holding my hands and telling me to trust her. "What's happening?" I said. "I will explain everything," she said, "but not here and not now. Right now, I need you to change out of that dress and leave this building through the servants' entrance at the rear of the house. I have clothes for you. I have a car waiting. Please." I looked at the locked door. I looked at Agnes Hartwell. I thought about Dorian, standing at the altar at the end of the aisle I had walked in my imagination so many times. I thought about my mother, seated in the front row of chairs in the East Ballroom. I thought about the 6 women in rose-colored gowns and the string quartet and the 3-tiered cake and everything I had spent 11 months building toward this moment. And then I looked again at Agnes Hartwell's face, and I saw something there that I cannot adequately describe to anyone who has not experienced it. The specific quality of a warning that comes from someone who has no personal stake in the outcome. Someone who is telling you something dangerous at some cost to themselves. Someone whose expression contains not urgency alone, but the weight of knowledge that cannot be transmitted any other way than by trusting it. I said, "Okay." She moved quickly after that. She had, as she had promised, clothes, a dark cardigan, a pair of trousers, flat shoes. She had thought of everything. There was a canvas bag large enough to accommodate the folded dress. She helped me out of the ivory silk with the same careful efficiency she might have applied to any practical task, her movements neither hurried nor unkind, and while I changed, she kept her eyes on the locked door and listened. We did not speak. When I was dressed, she took the bag with the wedding dress, slung it over her shoulder as though it were simply luggage, unlocked the door to the room's private bathroom, and revealed, behind a panel I had never noticed in the 2 previous visits, a narrow service staircase that descended into the back of the house. She gestured for me to follow. The staircase was steep and smelled of dust and old stone, lit by a single bulb at each landing. Agnes Hartwell descended it as confidently as she might have walked a familiar path in daylight, and I followed her, holding the railing, trying not to think about what was happening in the East Ballroom, trying not to think about the expression on Dorian's face when the wedding coordinator would have to walk to the altar and say something. What would she say? What did you say when the bride did not appear? The service staircase led out into a corridor behind the kitchens. The sounds and smells of catering were all around us. The clatter of trays, the smell of roasted meat, the voices of kitchen staff who barely glanced at us as we passed. Agnes walked through it all with the authority of someone entirely accustomed to this environment, and I stayed close behind her, wearing someone else's clothes, carrying nothing, my pearl hair clips still in my hair because there had been no time to remove them. The rear door of Aldermore Estate opened onto a service yard. Gravel, low lights, a dumpster, a row of catering vans. There was one other car, a dark sedan, its engine already running. Agnes opened the back door for me, and I got in. She got in the front passenger seat. The driver was a man I did not recognize, middle-aged, silent, who pulled out of the service yard and onto the lane behind the estate without being asked. I turned and looked through the rear window as we drove away. The main building of Aldermore Estate was lit from within, every window glowing. I could see the amber light of the East Ballroom. I could see, distantly, the shapes of people moving behind glass. And then the lane curved and the trees closed around us, and I could not see anything at all. I sat back in the seat and said, "Agnes, tell me." She turned in the front seat to look at me. Her expression had changed. The urgency had not left it exactly, but it had settled into something more complex, something that contained both relief and sorrow in equal measure. She said, "The name of the car parked in the private garage of this estate since this morning is registered to a man named Marcus Aurel." The name meant nothing to me. I said so. "Marcus Aurel is a prosecutor," she said. "He works for the Regional Financial Crimes Unit. He has been building a case for the past 2 years against a syndicate that laundered money through a network of property development companies." She paused. "One of those companies is a subsidiary of Holt Capital Management." I felt the temperature of the air inside the car change, or perhaps it was the temperature of my own body. "Dorian's company," I said. "His father's company," Agnes said. "But Dorian is a named partner and a signatory on multiple accounts. He has been aware of the financial structure for at least 3 years. There is documentation." I said nothing. I watched the dark countryside move past the window. "Mr. Aurel was brought in as a guest of the Holt family," Agnes continued. "He arrived this morning with a woman introduced as his wife and 2 men introduced as business associates. Those 2 men are not business associates. They are federal agents. They are here tonight for the purpose of serving an arrest warrant that was finalized this week." She stopped. I said, "Dorian." "The warrant is for Dorian," she said, "and his father, and 3 other individuals who are present as wedding guests tonight." The car was very quiet except for the sound of the engine and the soft rush of the road beneath us. I thought about the word warrant, about what that word meant in the context of the evening I had just left. The candles, the music, the ivory silk folded in a bag at Agnes Hartwell's feet. I thought about Dorian and how well I had believed I knew him, the 11 months of planning and the 4 years before that of a relationship I had understood to be solid and real. The signals had been there, I understood later. A certain vagueness about finances, a consistent deflection of certain conversations, a tendency to handle his phone with the focused tension of someone managing something unpleasant. But they were calibrated exactly to the threshold of noticeability, present enough to be real, absent enough to remain invisible unless you were specifically looking. I had not been specifically looking because I had trusted him, and I was not yet ready to examine too closely whether what I had believed was love was itself something I had been helped to construct. That examination came later. "Where are we going?" I said. "I have a house," Agnes said. 15 minutes from here. You can stay as long as you need." I did not cry that night. I would cry later, the next morning and the morning after that, and at unexpected moments for the following weeks. But that night I sat in the back of the dark car and felt something settle over me that was not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but a combination of the two that I had no word for, a feeling of terrible clarity, as though someone had handed me a lens ground to an exactness I had not known existed, and I was seeing something I had always been looking at without properly seeing it. The house where Agnes Hartwell lived was small and warm, a cottage on a half-acre lot at the edge of a village whose name I did not learn until the next morning. She showed me to a room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over a dark garden. She brought me tea. She sat with me in the kitchen for an hour and answered my questions as completely and honestly as she could, which was more honestly than I had been spoken to in a long time. The warrant had been executed at 9:47, while the first course was being served at what had been, for the guests still seated in the East Ballroom, a very confused and anxious reception whose groom was no longer present because he had been detained in the private study of the estate by 2 federal agents. His father had been detained simultaneously. The reception collapsed within 20 minutes. My mother had been told only that there had been a family emergency and that Alara was safe and would be in contact soon. I was grateful for that small mercy, because I was not yet ready to explain anything to anyone. I slept badly and woke early to a room full of gray September light. The pearl clips were still in my hair. I removed them and set them on the bedside table and looked at them. A kind of artifact, objects from a previous life, small and decorative and entirely pointless, and I put them in the pocket of the borrowed cardigan because I could not think of anything else to do with them. I could hear Agnes in the kitchen. The smell of coffee reached me through the door. I got up. She was at the stove when I came in. I had my hands flat on the cold stone and my head slightly bowed, and I was thinking about the word gratitude, about how insufficient it was, about how there was no word in any language I knew for the specific feeling of owing your life to someone who had no obligation to save it. The stone was cold and solid beneath my hands, and I was glad of that coldness, that solidity. I needed something real to hold on to. "Thank you," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Alara," she said. She crouched down so she was at my level, which was a thing I had not expected her to do, and she looked at me with those dark, still eyes, and she said, "Whatever comes next will be very hard, but you are clear of it. That is what matters." I looked at her. "How did you decide?" I said. "To help me. How did you decide to do it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Petra told me about you. She said you had been photographed at the estate tour, and that you looked at everything with the eyes of someone who believed in it. The flowers, the rooms, the whole thing. She said you looked like someone building something real." She paused, and I thought of a woman I knew once, many years ago, who walked into a situation she didn't understand because no one thought to warn her. I decided that if I could be in the position of being able to warn someone and choosing not to, I would not be able to live with that. I said, "The woman you knew, what happened to her?" Agnes Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. The kettle had begun to steam on the stove behind her. "She survived," she said at last, "but it took her a very long time." She stood and helped me to my feet and poured the coffee and set 2 cups on the table, and we sat across from each other in the small warm kitchen in the early morning light of September 16th, and she told me what she thought I needed to do next. There would be questions from the investigators. I would likely be contacted within the week. I would need a lawyer. I would need to contact my family. I would need to understand what I had and had not known, and to be very clear and very honest about the line between those 2 categories, because clarity and honesty were the things most likely to protect me. I listened to everything she said, and I wrote some of it down on the back of an envelope I found in a kitchen drawer. When she had finished, I asked her one more question. "The woman you knew, was she you?" Agnes Hartwell picked up her coffee cup. She looked at the middle distance for a moment, then she said, "Drink your coffee, Alara. It will get cold." I drank my coffee. The morning light shifted through the kitchen window and fell across the table between us, and outside in the garden I could see the shapes of late summer flowers going slightly ragged at the edges. And somewhere a bird was singing with the uncomplicated insistence of a creature who has no knowledge of the night that has just passed, who knows only the fact of the morning. My name is Alara Voss. I was 26 years old on the night I walked out of my own wedding in borrowed clothes through a service corridor behind the kitchens, and I did not know it then. But that exit was the first real choice I had made in a long time. Not the choice to trust Agnes Hartwell, though that was real enough. The choice underneath it, the choice, even for a moment, to consider the possibility that the story I had been living in was not the story I had been told it was. That was the crack through which everything else could enter. The following weeks were, as Agnes had predicted, very hard. There were lawyers, there were investigators, there were long conversations in rooms with recorders on the table, in which I was asked to account for everything I had known and when I had known it. Those conversations were uncomfortable not because I had anything to hide, but because they required me to look at everything I had not known, and the shape of what I had not known was large and strange, and said something about me that I was not comfortable hearing. Dorian had been careful in the way that people practicing sustained deception are careful. Not dramatic, not conspicuous, careful in the small and ordinary ways that are easiest to miss. In retrospect, the signals were there, calibrated exactly to the threshold of noticeability. I had not been looking because I had trusted him, and I had trusted him because I had loved him, and I was not yet ready to examine too closely whether what I had believed was love was itself something I had been helped to construct. That examination came later. A great deal came later. My mother was the hardest conversation. She had known something of Holt Capital, had known the name, had been quietly pleased by the association in the way that mothers sometimes are. And when I sat with her in her kitchen the day after and told her as much as I could tell her, she wept in a way she had not wept at my father's funeral. And I held her and let her weep, and tried not to count the cost of what had been spent building toward a wedding that had ended in a service corridor. Cora came that afternoon and held us both. She had suspected something was wrong. There had been something about the quality of the confusion that had spread through the East Ballroom, too specific and too directed to be a simple emergency. She had been right, and I was glad she was the kind of person who trusted her instincts. The legal situation resolved itself over several months. I was cleared entirely, as Agnes had predicted I would be, because the evidence was clear, and because I cooperated fully, and because the truth was, simply, that I had been peripheral to something I had not known was happening. Dorian's father received a sentence of 7 years. Dorian received 3, reduced to 18 months with cooperation. I did not speak to him again. There was a letter, once from a solicitor's address, which I opened and read and placed on the kitchen table and looked at for a long time. The letter said he was sorry. It said the situation had developed in ways he had not anticipated and had grown beyond what he knew how to undo. He said he had loved me. I thought about the word loved, about the past tense of it, about what it meant to use that tense in a letter to someone you had been about to marry. I did not write back. Agnes Hartwell and I began to have dinner together on Sunday evenings. She had helped me find a flat in the village nearest to her cottage, a sensible 1-bedroom above a hardware shop, and in the first weeks I found myself walking the half-mile to her cottage on Sunday afternoons without quite planning to. She was not a demonstrative woman. She did not offer easy reassurances or comfortable fictions. She had a quality that I came to think of as honest witness. She saw you clearly, and she said what she saw, and she did not soften it unnecessarily, but she also did not use sharpness for its own sake. In those Sunday evenings over the course of the autumn, I told her things I had not told anyone else. I told her about the morning before the wedding when I had stood at the bridal suite window looking for the feeling of rightness and had not found it. I told her about the pearl clips in my pocket and what they had come to mean to me as a symbol, not of loss exactly, but of the specific kind of self-knowledge that comes only after the fact. She listened to all of it. She offered very little in return except attention, which was, I came to understand, exactly the right thing to offer. It was in those Sunday evenings that I began to understand what had happened to the woman she had known, the woman whose survival had taken a long time. I never asked again directly. I did not need to. The shape of what she told me assembled itself over the months into something I could read. She had been young. There had been a man. There had been a house and a promise and a structure of trust built with great care over a long time and then used against her in ways that took years to fully understand. She had survived. It had taken her a long time. The woman who had eventually emerged from that survival was the woman sitting across from me at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings. Compact, straight-backed, possessed of those dark, still eyes that saw things clearly and said what they saw, who had spent 23 years keeping other people's secrets in other people's houses, and who had chosen, on one particular September night, to break protocol on behalf of a woman she did not know, because the alternative was something she could not live with. Agnes Hartwell had not saved me by accident. She had saved me on purpose, with full knowledge of the cost to herself, because she had been through something similar, and because she had stood at the door in the bridal suite, not as a housekeeper doing her job, but as a woman who had learned the hard way what it meant to have no one open that door for you. Petra, Agnes's niece, came to visit in November. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s, serious and warm in equal measure, with something in her manner that reminded me of her aunt. We had tea in Agnes's kitchen, and Petra apologized to me for the disruption, which struck me as absurd, and I told her so. She said she had worried about whether she was making the right decision, calling Agnes, involving someone else. She said she had gone back and forth on it for 2 weeks before she made the call. I asked her what had decided her. She said she had seen a photograph of me taken at the estate tour, a candid shot someone had posted. and in the photograph I was standing in one of the estate rooms with my head slightly tilted to one side looking at a wall painting. And there was something in my posture, the particular quality of believing in something, that had made her think of her aunt, of what her aunt would have done if she had been the kind of person who had someone in her corner when she needed one. I thought about that for a long time, the way that one woman's experience had translated, through the lens of an image and the recognition of a quality in a stranger's posture, into a decision that had changed the course of my life, the fragility of that chain, the astonishing improbability that it had held. Winter came. I settled into the flat above the hardware shop. I kept working. I was a landscape architect, and the work was steady and absorbing, the kind of work that requires you to think carefully about how things grow and what they need, and how to build something lasting on a foundation you can trust. I thought sometimes about the irony of that, and other times I thought it was not ironic at all, that perhaps I had chosen the work for the same reasons I had needed to learn its lessons. The pearl clips sat on my windowsill. I had washed them and placed them there in the first week in the flat, and they had stayed there through the autumn and into winter, catching the light in the morning when it came through the window at a low angle, decorative and pointless and somehow necessary. I did not know what to do with them exactly, only that I was not ready to put them away. In the spring, I began to work on a design for a small garden. It was not a commission. It was the garden behind Agnes's cottage, which had gone ragged over the winter, and which she mentioned once, almost in passing, that she had never quite managed to get right on her own. I drew up plans over several weeks and showed them to her on a Sunday evening in April. She looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "This is too much work for me to ask of you." I said, "You didn't ask." She looked at me. I looked back. "Let me do this," I said. "Please." She nodded once. We began in May. I worked on the garden most weekends through the spring and into the summer, and Agnes worked alongside me more often than not, neither of us speaking much, which was a kind of comfort in itself, the comfort of working beside someone in a shared silence that does not need to be filled. I planted things that would come back year after year, perennials mostly, and some small shrubs at the corners, and along the back wall a climbing rose in a deep, warm red that would take 2 years to establish properly, but would, once established, come back every summer without fail and ask very little in return. Agnes watched me plant the rose and said nothing for a moment and then said, "That will outlast both of us." I pressed the last of the soil around the base of the canes and sat back on my heels and said, "That's the point." On the last Sunday of that summer, I brought a bottle of wine to the cottage, and we sat in the garden in the late afternoon light and drank it. And the climbing rose was small still, just getting its footing, and the rest of the garden was beginning to look like something intentional, something that had been thought about. Agnes said, looking out at it, "It's better than I expected." "It'll be even better next year," I said. "And the year after that?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you all right?" Really. I thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. I thought about the before and the after, and the distance between them, and what had been lost in crossing it, and what, unexpectedly, had been found. I thought about the 11 months of planning and the ivory silk and the candied violets and the pearl clips on the windowsill. I thought about the service staircase and the cold flagstone floor and the early morning light in a kitchen I had not known existed. "Yes," I said, and I meant it in the complicated way that yes sometimes means, the way that contains both the truth and its cost simultaneously, the way that is not the yes of uncomplicated happiness, but the yes of someone who has survived something and knows the value of what survival has given them. Agnes nodded. She raised her glass. I raised mine. The light was long and golden over the garden, the kind of light that September afternoons carry sometimes, the kind that makes everything look both beautiful and slightly valedictory, as though the season is taking its leave beautifully and wants you to notice. I noticed. The climbing rose threw a small shadow on the wall behind it. Next summer it would be bigger. The summer after that, bigger still. That was the nature of things that were planted well and tended honestly. They came back, and they came back, and eventually they became something that no one would believe had ever been small. Something that looked as though it had always been there, as though it had always been certain of itself, as though it had never once needed anything from anyone, as though it had never once required someone to crouch on the cold floor of a kitchen and whisper thank you into the only language that was adequate to what had been given.